Well, good morning, good morning, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, continuing our series, The Formation of the Deep State. And we are on chapter 11 today. And we've covered a lot of ground in the backstory of the creation of the deep state. And just quickly started with the Ultra Vires doctrine, the rise of the corporations. And I've explained and re-explained what Ultra Vires was and is. And part of the objective of this channel is to note the exact time that these robber barons or deep staters, their treachery became treason. And we established that as being the Spanish-American War and the desire for these overseas empires, but somehow they're going to have to convince the American people to support a foreign war. We'd never fought a foreign war. And so they used basically a psyop against the American people, where they betrayed the American people, betrayed America into a war where people lost their lives. That's treason. And they used three methods. The first method was to propagandize the American people through the yellow press. The second method was to manufacture evidence and ensure that through that yellow press. And thirdly was to launch a false flag attack against an American target, which in this case was the USS Maine, whereby 266 Americans were killed. And of course, the blame was laid at the feet of the Spanish. The American people had the pump had been sufficiently primed so that the American people supported the war after that point. That became a template going forward. If we need to, we can always resort to these same methods. And of course, in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War came the rise of imperialism and the desire for overseas territories, for markets, for raw materials, for territory, for military bases, and to prevent other countries from getting their hands on it first, social Darwinism. And so we purchased Alaska, we stole Hawaii, the war gave us dominion over Cuba, also gave us outright the colonies of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Wake Island, Guam. We developed the spheres of influence, which, of course, Teddy Roosevelt and his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine informed the rest of the world that no longer is just the contiguous United States our territory or our sphere of influence. We now have added to that to include Latin America, South America, and also the Far East. And so we dug the Panama Canal so we could get a one ocean navy back and forth between the Atlantic and the Pacific. We put a base in Guantanamo to oversee our sphere of influence in Latin America. We put a base in the Philippines to oversee the sphere of influence in the Far East and Asia. And that yielded us, these corporate titans, these CEOs, these owners of these companies, these 50 to 60 men are running everything. It yielded them fortunes because of all these new raw materials and new markets and on it went. Well, then we got into World War One, and yesterday, or chapter 10, we discussed the second time that treason is used against the American people to sucker us into another foreign war. This is World War One. Now, in this case, I believe the British handled all of the dirty work as far as the propaganda. They're the ones who cut the transatlantic cable and handled the propaganda. They're the ones who manufactured the evidence, the Zimmerman note, and of course used their propaganda uh, uh, to share that with the American people. And they're the ones who sent the Lusitania into harm's way and ensuring that American life would be lost when that ship got sunk, which they knew it would be sunk. And but I believe that they were acting all the while in collusion with the American government, because the American government knew that the only way it would get a seat at the peace table after World War I was over was if it participated in the war in some manner, shape, form. How was Woodrow Wilson supposed to get the support from American people to go to war in what was basically a European war at that time, absent these this false flag with the Lusitania, the manufactured evidence with the Zimmerman note, and the propaganda from the British. And so we worked in collusion with the British. It don't really matter who does it. That was our closest ally. We desperately wanted the Allies to win. We have a special relationship with Britain. Russia was about to drop out. The Allies were in dire need of a recruit, sort of like a lottery pick. You think about the NBA draft, and the top few picks are what they call lottery picks. They're game changers. The United States was a game changer. And if Russia's going to drop out, the Allies needed a game changer. So, and we needed to be in the war because we wanted to be at the peace table. So the motives are on both sides. We established yesterday the motive that means the opportunity were there for the British to carry this out. And we let them do it because it got us, it put us where we wanted to be, which was in the war at the very end when most of the heavy fighting had already taken place. So it'd be kind of like the Spanish-American War in the sense that it was just another splendid little war that we would come out on the winning side and get to be involved in the setting of the terms, the redrawing of the maps, so to speak, after World War I ended. So that's 2 times now that these power elites have committed treason against America to get us involved in 2 foreign wars. We got 100 years, no foreign wars, and all of a sudden, back to back, Spanish-American War, and if you really want to be technical about it, Filipino insurrection, and now the World War I. So 3 wars in a couple decades. So that's the change that has occurred now that the power elites are behind the scenes, realizing how much money can be made with the expansion of our empire. And then once we expand our empire, realizing we have to defend that empire, we have to defend our interests around the world. So Europe's problems become our problems. So we're getting drawn into this by these power elites' desire for money. And I told you in addition to noting the time when treachery became treason, I also wanted to draw attention to when Ultra Vires transitioned from the private sector into the public sector. Ultra Vires says corporations only have one objective, that's to maximize profits. They are not to consider the public interest. In fact, if they do, they could be fired. And they're immunized. In the pursuit of these profits, they're immunized. All the persons working for the corporation are immunized. They don't have to worry about any liability, criminal or civil. And then the corporation itself is immunized. They can hide their revenues, their income, so they don't have to pay taxes. They can hide their assets, so civil litigation can't get at them. So that, as long as it stays in the private sector, an argument can be made, well, that's capitalism run amok, and the government's job is to regulate that, to prevent it from becoming abusive or exploitive. If at any point ultravirus seeps into the government, the people have no recourse. We have nobody speaking for us. We have no voice because now the government is operating as a corporation, maximizing profits, public interest be damned, and immunizing itself so it can do whatever it wants. That is tyranny. That's what that is. That's tyranny. So that occurs. That takes place. We want to note when that takes place. And that's the point of today's topic. So April 6, 1917 is the official date, the declaration of war. And now the European War is a world war. I'm not going to get too deep into World War I. That's not the point of this channel, other than to say you can see exponentially the numbers are increasing as far as American soldiers and their participation levels. Spanish-American War was a splendid little war in the sense that very few Americans were touched by the war. It wasn't that many soldiers who had to go fight. Very few died, 3,000, I think. Here, over 1 million Americans served, 50,000 died, and 230,000 were wounded. Now, this was the first war with some of these new, very advanced, at least for that time, machinery and weaponry. In that day, they would be considered weapons of mass destruction. For example, one torpedo from a sub sinks a ship. Hundreds of people are going to die at a time. The machine gun, you don't even have to aim the thing. You just aim it, just point it in the right direction and start shooting and spraying bullets. You're gonna kill some people. That's a weapon of mass destruction. The poison gas, that was a weapon of mass destruction. The tank, that was a weapon of mass destruction. You go on and on. There was just all these new weapons. And of course, the strategies of fighting wars hadn't kept up. And so a lot of people died senselessly in the trenches, where the war just sort of stalemated, but also as a result of the gases and as a result of being ordered to charge pell-mell into tanks and machine gun fire. And you had these big guns behind the lines, flinging shells at the trenches. And here you got these soldiers huddled in these trenches, basically sitting ducks. And so a lot of folks were just getting killed, and no movement was taking place. It was a stalemate for a long time. Anyway, it was a terribly destructive war, and in order to raise a force of this size, the American government had to do something that's not ever popular, and that is to pass the Selective Service Act, which authorized a draft. And the draft was determined by a blind draw. They called it the Great National Lottery. 24 million men registered for this draft, of which 3 million were drafted, of which 1.3 million served. So when you start looking at that number, 24 million registered, which means 24 million men are at risk of being drafted, all of a sudden that's touching a lot more American families. And then of the 24 million, uh, one out of 8 is getting drafted. So if you're in a class of 30 kids and there's 15 of them are boys, 2 of those boys are getting drafted. And that means in every schoolroom, in every classroom of every school, in every community, a handful of their young boys are going out to fight in this foreign war at the very minimum. So this is having a larger effect on the American population than the Spanish American one. That's what you're going to notice as we continue on through history, the impact, whether societal or economical or financial, emotional, psychological. I mean, all these different effects grow with each succeeding war because the demands become heavier and heavier upon the American population and disproportionate, because if you have the right dad or if you have enough money, you can buy yourself out of the draft. You can get someone to substitute in your place. Poor kids didn't have any choice. They had to go. So what I want to focus on today, though, is the transition of ultra vires from the private sector into the public. And it happens when Woodrow Wilson starts hand selecting people to come in and run the wartime economy, to run our country during the war. And he's looking around, he said, I need the best and brightest to come in and do what they do best, which they've established a reputation for doing in the private sector. I need them to do it in the public sector because we got to get right. This is a world war. This is an existential threat to our existence. And so everything needs to be focused on the war effort. And so one of the men he chose to run the War Industries Board was Bernard Baruch. Now, my point in highlighting these three names as we go forward today is to show who is being invited in to the public sector and what their backgrounds are, and how Ultra Vires makes its way into our government. It's through these three men, which will be greatly expanded upon by Franklin Delano Roosevelt when we get to World War II, because Roosevelt's going to look back at the example of World War I, how well it worked, and he's going to double down on that. So who was Bernard Baruch? He started off as a broker for A.A. Hausman Company, and he worked, eventually didn't work for them very long, but he eventually accumulated enough money he could buy a seat on the New York Stock Exchange for what would be in 2024 about $725,000, so $725,000. So this guy was doing, and this is all before age 30. And in fact, by the age of 30, he had amassed such a fortune on the New York Stock Exchange, and most of it came from speculating in the sugar market. And most of that sugar speculation was related to the sugar industry coming out of Hawaii. You remember who's running Hawaii now for these power elites? Sanford Dole, another one of these corporation owners. And so this guy, Bernard Baruch, is making his money, his fortune, his personal fortune on the sugar industry, which is dependent upon and completely contingent upon our domination of the annexation of the territory of Hawaii. You remember, we stole Hawaii. Later, he founded the Intercontinental Rubber Company of New York, which got its natural resources for the rubber market from its holdings in Mexico, foreign territory. And he listened to his partners. He had some pretty amazing partners in this rubber industry. Nelson Aldrich, Daniel Guggenheim, John D. Rockefeller, George Foster Peabody. He, yeah, you're talking about the who's who. Remember, this is why I said the same 50 or 60 men ran everything, because they would partner with the same 50 or 60 men in their industry, who would then partner with them in return in the other industry. And so it was the same 50, 60 men running everything. By 1903, Baruch had his own brokerage firm, and he was nicknamed the Lone Wolf of Wall Street. The Lone Wolf of Wall Street. I think Hollywood recently made a movie called Wolf of Wall Street, loosely based on the character of Bernard Baruch. He was called the Lone Wolf because he refused to go in with any other brokerage house. He always stayed independent to himself. By 1910, he was one of Wall Street's best known financiers. All right, so this guy understands how to make a dollar and how to maximize profits. That's been his life to this point. And that's who Woodrow Wilson tapped to oversee the entire war industry, basically, in America in the lead up and during World War I. Bernard Baruch decided what products were made, where they went, and how much these products would cost. In other words, he was sort of he was like the boss hog of the entire U.S. economy. So you could say that, I've made the point many, many times that these 50, 60 men that are running all these big corporations are in essence running the entire U.S. economy. And as such, because they're the ones with all the money making the contributions, they're running the U.S. government as well. But during World War I, you need to whittle that number down to one. One man was running all the U.S. economy, and his name was Bernard Baruch. And of course, his background was exclusively private sector. So when he came into the public sector, he brought with him the Ultra Vires doctrine, the governing principle that it's all about maximizing profits, public interest be damned, and you immunize yourself so you're not at risk, nor is your corporation at risk. If you apply that to the government, that now means the government is in the business of making money, or in this case, making products, whatever. Public interest be damned. The larger interest here is the war. and you immunize yourself, the government, so that there's no liability towards the government. In fact, a lot of the things, the laws and things that get passed, the practices during World War I would be challenged in court. And the reasoning that courts supported the government action during World War I was, well, this was temporary, and we were under an existential threat, and extreme times call for extreme measures. So the courts validated the immunity that the government sought during this period and enabled the government to basically halt capitalism temporarily and run our government with total absolute control, which is the working definition of communism, if you want to be technical about it. And of course, they were allowed to do that. Extreme times call for extreme measures. The second guy that Wilson invited in was Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was called in to run the Food Administration. We're going to have to feed. We had an issue in the Spanish-American War getting supplies across the ocean to our soldiers fighting in the Philippines and Cuba. We learned a lesson from that. You know, a lot of the food ended up spoiled, which whatever. But we never were in jeopardy of running out. It was such a small force and a short war, it didn't really matter. But this was Europe, and our allies needed our help too. So we were in a position of having to help feed our allies who were over there starving, our own troops, and still feed the American population. So the scarcity of food is going to be an issue. So Herbert Hoover was called in, and he began setting high prices for wheat and other ag products, so that it would encourage farmers to raise those crops because they didn't get paid well for them. And then he instituted here domestically conservation programs, encouraging through voluntary cooperation. It was one of the brilliant moves of Hoover, was he understood the psyche of the American people. You know, it's already asking them a lot to support a foreign war, especially if their boy got drafted. And now you're telling them they can't eat, and you're cutting off their food supply. That's a problem. But if you ask them to do their part and voluntarily submit to this program, participate in this program, they will do that if they think it's their idea. You know, he understood the psyche of the American people. I think it's just humanity in general, actually. But so he introduced these conservation program: wheatless Mondays and Wednesdays, meatless Tuesdays, porkless Thursdays and Saturdays. And you know, these were all aimed at the products that he knew we needed to conserve the most of. So what was Herbert Hoover's background? Herbert Hoover, before the turn of the century, was took a position with a London-based mining company that was working out of Australia and China. And this made him a wealthy man, a very, very wealthy engineer in the mining industry. And his raw materials that his mining company was extracting, was coming from our sphere of influence, the Far East, specifically China, which we all know that the resource-rich part of China is Manchuria. And hang on, that's going to come into play later on too. But so again, another private industry titan, a guy in the mining. So far he's tapped or recruited somebody from the stock market who understands how to maximize profits, and somebody from the mining industry who understands how to access raw materials and make his mining company successful. He became extremely wealthy in the private industry, and now he is coming over to the public sector to run the Food Administration for Woodrow Wilson. And he too is very familiar as the head of a corporation with the Ultra Vires doctrine, and whether he intentionally or unintentionally, you can make an argument that he sort of violated Ultra Vires by making the conservation program voluntary. But you could counter argue that and say, well, he understood that his job was to succeed in this conservation program, and that his best chance of success was to make it voluntary. However you want to look at it, This is another private sector businessman being invited into the public sector, bringing with him ultra vires, this doctrine that says maximize profits, public interest be damned, immunize yourself and the entity for whom you work. So that's the second private sector business tycoon. And then the third one is George Creel. One of the things that Woodrow Wilson and his government is going to be concerned about is public information. What the American people have access to as far as information is concerned. Remember now, during the Spanish-American War, the information was controlled and filtered through a yellow press, mainly through the Hearst and Pulitzer newspaper empires, whom were both controlled by part of this. They were both controlled by these 50, 60 men who owned all these corporations. And so they do whatever they were told. And the marching orders in those days was to sell the American people on fighting this foreign war against Spain. That's what they did. Now, the public information that is coming into America is being, as far as the information from Europe is concerned, it's all being filtered through Britain. And they are propagandizing the American people. They are filtering out any information that might be advantageous to the enemy side, Germany, etc. And they're presenting one side of the story to the American people. And it's just gone on and on. They cut the transatlantic cable. We have no ability to independently get access to that information. We have to take whatever the British give us. So essentially, we are being propagandized again. Now that we are in the war and that propaganda did its job, Wilson is interested in trying to raise money for the war. So you're going to have to continue propagandizing the American people so they'll buy war bonds and finance the war, but also keep support for the war effort high by demonizing the Germans, demonizing the opposing side, and glorifying the American side or the Allies. And you can't risk having people going out speaking out against the war. This is a problem because we have an amendment that guarantees right to free speech. And again, here we go with another situation where the courts are going to uphold these actions, these laws that are passed, these sedition laws, for example, that make saying anything critical of the government illegal. You can be imprisoned for it. Or anything critical of the war effort. It became illegal if you say it publicly. And so on the public square during World War I, Woodrow Wilson, in an effort to propagandize the American people, basically suspended the right to free speech. And the courts upheld him again because the drastic times call for drastic measures. So the government immunized itself. And the guy he picked to run this Committee on Public Information, which is out there policing what people are saying, policing what newspapers are printing, policing what public speakers are saying at events, et cetera, what's being published, what's being broadcast, et cetera. And then also, in addition to playing defense, also going on offense and paying for public speakers to go out and parrot the party line, paying for artists to go out and paint billboards on the sides of barns, etc., that are very patriotic themes, etc., to continue to keep morale high, etc. Distributing posters like these posters you see on the left here. All these posters have a common theme, which is that the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, whatever, are these brutes. You see the top one there, the mad brute. And he's got the German helmet on. You can tell it's got the little spike on it. And asking young men to enlist in the army to save this poor damsel that's in distress. Because if you don't, this mad brute is going to come for your women. It's pretty obvious what the theme of that is. The bottom one, halt the Hun. again, here's a Hun. You can tell by he's got that German. That Hun, by the way, is a pejorative term referring to German soldiers. He's got the spike on the helmet. That's the kind of helmet they wore. So if you're going to smear a German soldier, you put that distinctive helmet on his head. He's trying to attack this woman who's protecting her little child, and the only thing standing between him and the rape and mutilation of that mom and baby is this American soldier. And that one is saying buy bonds. This becomes the job of George Creel running this committee. First is to defend against any criticism of the government on the war effort. His goal was to sell America, to get people to buy war bonds, distribute pamphlets and press releases that advertise the war successes, send out people that are hired by the government to paint and speak and create these posters, advertising campaigns that promote the war effort. It's propaganda. All right, all has a point, all has an agenda. What's George Creel's background? Creel started working for William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer's newspapers as a comic writer. He wrote comic strips. And in 1913, there was a profile of him in Collier's magazine where he said he would shut himself in his cheap room in a mechanic's hotel and grind out jokes by the dozens, by the hundreds, and jokes in bales and jokes in bundles. That's what he says. So he was writing for the Hearst and Pulitzer newspapers, which are the yellow press of the Spanish-American War. These two guys own all the papers. His joke writing career came crashing down when he didn't sell very many jokes. And eventually he was hired by Hearst's famous newspaper called the Evening Journal and became a regular with many other periodicals as a result. And he did so because 4 of his comic strips were noticed by a publisher with the Evening Journal, and it was those 4. He'd been writing these things, shoveling them out by the hundreds for years, never getting any notice, and on the verge of losing his job. 4 of his comics got noticed by his publisher. He gets hired by the Evening Journal, becomes a regular. And today we'd say he's like a syndicated columnist or a syndicated comic artist or whatever they call it. People who write comics. Anyway, by 1899, right about the turn of the century, he went back to Kansas City. Now he's accumulated wealth by this point, enough to, with a friend, go in and buy or start a newspaper called The Independent. And after a period of time, he bought out his partner, and he became the sole owner, editor, and publisher of The Independent. All right, so this guy is straight out of the yellow press tradition of he earned his money, he earned his bones, made his bones, so to speak, working for Hearst and Pulitzer. And these were the yellow press newspapers during the Spanish-American War. And now he owns his own. He learned from Hearst and Pulitzer how to do it. Now he owns his own, and he's the guy that Wilson taps to come in and run this committee on public information. So he too has been in a private industry where 2 of the richest men in the world, Hearst and Pulitzer, who basically own all the publishing rights when it comes to newspapers in America. And so he's very familiar with that industry. He goes, learns the industry at their feet, and then he takes what he's learned, he goes and he starts his own newspaper, and it becomes a big success. So that's who is tapped. And so here again is another private sector guy who's bringing with him everything he was taught about building a successful corporation. And that's what a newspaper is. It's a corporation. It's like any other corporation. You maximize profits, public interest be damned. Now, you'd think a newspaper would be more responsive to public interest because they got to get people to buy the newspaper. But we all know ads pay the bills for newspapers. So he understood his market, how to make money. He was very successful. And his job was to come in, defend America's position in the war, and go on offense and sell America on the war. Get them to buy bonds, get them to continue to support the war effort, get people to enlist, basically to propagandize the American people. And in order to enforce this, the sedition law was passed, and people could go to prison. I know Eugene Debs went to prison for giving a speech critical of the war effort, critical of the government. He was arrested and he went to prison for it. The courts, again, upheld this because they said drastic times call for drastic measures. So here we see three private sector men who have succeeded wildly in the private sector, each in their own right. One in the mining industry, another in the stock market, and another in the newspaper business. And because of their expertise and their proficiency in doing their private sector job, Woodrow Wilson says they'll be perfect for this public sector position. Not realizing, maybe not even caring, that coming with them is ultra vires, this doctrine that is now not going to be an influence on the American government from the outside, whereby you're donating money to these politicians to run for office, and then when you need to, you call on them to do your bidding. So you sort of, it's like a one step removed. Now they're inside the halls of power. Now they are running the entire U.S. economy. They are running the entire U.S. Food campaign during the war. They are running the flow of public information. They're running critical parts of the United States, whether economy or the critical parts of the United States machinery, so to speak, that make a war effort possible. They are in charge, and they're going to succeed wildly. And of course, the courts are going to back everything they do, which gives them immunity to do whatever they want. Congress will pass laws like the sedition law I just mentioned, which gives them complete immunity to do whatever they want. So you start to see this ultra vires doctrine, which is they're not necessarily trying to maximize profits now. The goal here is to, if you're Bernard Baruch, is to maximize the amount of machinery and weapons and everything needed for the war effort, maximize that so we can win the war. And public interest be damned. So if we have to freeze wages, we'll freeze wages during this period of time so that nobody gets a raise. We're not worried about the public interest right now. We're worried about winning the war. And if people take us to court over this, the courts will rule in our favor. Congress will pass laws that enable us to do what we need to do. If I'm running the Food Administration, and the point is to feed the Europeans, to feed the American soldiers, still feed the American population. So if we have to ration, so be it. And we'll ask the American people to cooperate. And I think the ultimate hammer was if the American people hadn't cooperated, they could have gone past laws and courts would have backed them. And then as far as public information, we're going to suspend the First Amendment. You can't say whatever you want. You're not free to criticize the government, criticize the war effort. And the hammer is the law that was passed and the courts that will uphold it, and people will actually go to jail. And so you see the irony here is that we are suspending capitalism to build a war machine. And Bernard Baruch is running it with an iron fist, backed by the legislature, backed by the courts, picked by the president. He's in the literal sense of a word, he's the economic tyrant of America during this period. And we do not have capitalism or free enterprise during this period of time. We have communism because it's total absolute control from the top down. Same thing with the Food Administration. And So, and as far as public information, we temporarily suspend Amendment 1, freedom of the press, right? Freedom of speech. We're temporarily suspending Amendment 1, giving George Creel ultimate responsibility to decide what you can say, what you can't. Congress passes sedition law to back him up, courts back him up, total immunity. The goal is to sell, propagandize, sell America, sell the war effort, sell war bonds, and keep Americans on the side of us fighting in this war. And it's straight propaganda. And so, you know, we're suspending capitalism, we're suspending the First Amendment, and we're taking total absolute control out of Washington. And it works. It works, which is why Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when World War II happens, will copy it and actually put it on steroids. It'll be even a bigger deal because we're in World War II much longer than World War I. Anyway, on November 11, 1918, and go back, and this is a point I really want to make. Go back to my first slide here. So we joined in April 6th of 1917. November 11, 1918, you get the armistice or the surrender from Germany and Austria-Hungary. So we were only in the war about 18 months. We were Johnny-come-latelys to the war. So as far as when you look at the casualty counts, you see 5 million Allied soldiers died in this war, and 8 million Central Power soldiers, 13 million between the two sides. This is the first war where civilians were actually targeted. It became fair game, so to speak. So you add all that up, you're getting really close to 20 million people died in what was supposedly the war to end all wars. But the American casualty count was much lower, much lower, because we joined so late. And that's going to become an issue going forward. But the main thrust of today's episode is to show how the private sector ultra vires doctrine crept in, and it didn't invade, it didn't come in unsolicited, it was invited in. Because at a time of national crisis, Woodrow Wilson invited 3 of the top private sector industry heads into his government to run segments of our economy. And that ultra vires doctrine is now inside our government. Now, it's counterbalanced by basically a progressive president, Woodrow Wilson, who is still the head of the government. But eventually, you have to start somewhere. This is sort of the gateway into the public sector. Eventually, there will be many more of these ultra vires industry heads running segments of the U.S. government that a single president cannot stand up against this doctrine. And it just like cancer, it metastasizes and spreads and takes over. And at some point, it controls our government. And presidents, just like we've talked before with Woodrow Wilson, he's already experienced, since he's become president, that he has limits to his authority. And when he becomes president, having run a campaign saying, I will never use military force like Roosevelt did. I won't try to buy foreign territory like Taft did. And a problem erupts in Haiti. He is informed by these power elites. We have interests down there. That's part of our empire. That's in our sphere of influence. You will do what needs to be done to defend those interests. And so he sends the military down. Same thing in Mexico. Same thing in World War I. So a man who ran for office claiming he would never use military force has to use it 3 different times because he's already experiencing what it's like to be the guy who is elected to shepherd or oversee this empire that he has inherited. And he realizes right quick, it's going to require It may require military force. And no one who's behind the scenes, unelected and unaccounted, but making money off this empire is going to stand by and allow him to just let these territories walk away. They're not going to allow him to lose their money spigot, so to speak. And so he's already experienced the limitations of his power there. And succeeding presidents are going to lose more and more power going forward as the beast, this deep state beast, which is it takes over the government. And it comes in as a lamb, but eventually becomes a lion. And now it is the tail wagging the dog, so to speak. So Ultra Vires was invited into the public sector. It starts off as a private sector thing, and it gets invited into the public sector during a time of crisis. And it doesn't go away after the war. It just grows and grows like a cancer until it is the government. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for listening in. Subscribe to my channel if you are interested. Also, smash the like button and share this channel with others. And feel free to comment in the comment section. Thank you. Until next time, God bless.